Well, welcome all. We are thrilled to have you here for our discussion about why great books matter, a conversation with Roosevelt Montás in conversation with our own Noah Chafets. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the dean here at the University of Chicago Graham School, and I'll welcome you to our wintry mix on campus on this gorgeous winter day. We are, for those of you who are not familiar, the home of really ambitious and rigorous lifelong learning. And we have been here from the founding of our university because when the university was being set up by our founding president, William Rainey Harper, there was a vision to extend the ideas well beyond the walls and the traditional undergraduates to people across all ages and stages of life. And that commitment remains true to this day. And one of the ways we bring that commitment to lifelong learning to life is through the basic program of liberal education for adults, a program that will be celebrating its 80th anniversary next year. And that is a 4-year curriculum where you explore timeless works of literature, philosophy, history, and social thought. And really, you look at these great books that help us to live better, more examined, and more deeply considered lives. And the chair of that program, Noah Chafets, will be moderating today's conversation. With that, I want to introduce our speakers and then get out of the way because I want to learn alongside all of you. Roosevelt Montás is Senior Lecturer in American Studies and English at Columbia University. He's also the former director of Columbia's Center for the Core Curriculum. In 2003, he completed his PhD in English at Columbia. He regularly teaches moral and political philosophy in the Columbia Core Curriculum, as well as seminars in American Studies. He's also the director of the Center for American Studies Freedom and Citizenship Program, which brings low-income high school students to the Columbia campus to study political theory and then help them prepare successful applications to college. He is, most importantly for this conversation, the author of Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. As I mentioned, he'll be in conversation with our own Noah Chafets, who is the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program of Liberal Education for Adults. Noah holds his BA in philosophy from Vassar College and a PhD here from the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought. He has taught high school students in Boston and Shanghai and taught undergraduates at the university, primarily in core sequences, before coming into the basic program, where he has thrived and now become our chair. His interests are well represented by the texts in the basic program, but also extend to contemporary ethics and practical philosophy, aesthetics, and film. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to spotlight Noah and Roosevelt and turn it over to Noah to move our conversation forward.
All right. Thanks so much, Seth. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks especially to Roosevelt for the book. Thank you for being with us today to speak about it. It's difficult for me to think of a more natural audience for this book than the community of the basic program of liberal education and the liberal arts community at the Graham School more generally. And I'm going to begin by recommending this book with great enthusiasm to anyone who's watching today. You, Roosevelt, say in the book that in a classroom, quote, "The liberal arts teacher casts sparks with his or her own intellectual activity before the student. Some of these sparks land on dry kindling and start a fire that is the student's own." And end quote. For me, reading the book was an experience of catching a great profusion of such sparks, and I'm sure that the resulting fires will continue to spread in me and perhaps beyond me for some time. So I'm going to get to my questions. Among books that advocate for liberal education, one thing that's distinctive and compelling about yours is that it blends advocacy with autobiography, as well as textual interpretation. I'm going to ask you a minute about in a moment about this blending, but to start off with, could you tell us a bit about your personal history with liberal education?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Noah, for having me here, and Seth and Marina, who put everything together behind the scenes. Really a pleasure to be here in this forum. A huge fan of the basic program, and my God, what an extraordinary way to spend part of your time. by revisiting these books in conversation, and doing so, I think it's a big plus outside the context of grading and credentialing. Then we can get to the true value, the true point of this experience, which has nothing to do with credentials and has nothing to do with grades. My background, goodness, I'm an immigrant. I came to the United States just shy of my 12th birthday, and come from the Dominican Republic. Maybe some of you have visited, some of you might know a thing or two about it. It's an island in the Caribbean. It's used to be called part of the third world. Now they call it the developing world. And the island, Hispaniola, is split between two nations, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. I grew up in a rural small town in the Dominican Republic. In some ways, I think of the world in which I grew to look more like the 19th century than the 20th century. It was a place without paved roads, without electricity, with uneven running water. I mean, some of these things came while I was a child. I remember roads being paved, but I grew up in very much this kind of rural poverty. Although poverty in a rural third world situation is quite different than poverty in like an urban first world, or even rural first world. So I grew up without a TV. I grew up without stove, without a phone, a refrigerator, and nobody that I knew went to college. My parents, my father, fourth grade was the highest grade he did. My mother did some high school, what she was an adult. I remember she never finished in the Dominican Republic. In the 80s, there was a huge migration of Dominicans to the Dominican Republic, mainly poor Dominicans, and I was among them. My mother had come just after when I was 9, just after I had turned 9 years old. She came to the U.S. and then managed to arrange for papers for my brother and I to come. So here I landed in New York City, JFK, 2 days shy of my 12th birthday, not speaking English, haven't been even close to an airplane before. And that began my sort of American life. And, I tell some of the story in the book. Sometimes you might think of a background like that as being a huge disadvantage. And in some ways it was. Not speaking English as a teenager, not having any kind of what sociologists call cultural capital, connections. When it came time to apply to college, I had no idea what the Ivy League was. I had no idea what a residential college was, what a liberal arts college was. I just had absolutely no access to the kind of information that can help you shape and organize a life. So in that way, it's clearly a disadvantage. But there are other ways in which having to learn that, in which having to sort of navigate this world in a very conscious way has turned from a disadvantage to a huge advantage. That is the person I am today, the way I understand the world. And some of the fundamental commitments I have been forged by that experience and really organize my life today. As the title of my book signals, a great book's education, which I got at Columbia, utterly transformed my life. And one of the reasons why I wrote this book, and one of the reasons why the personal story is in there, is because my case happens to present a very clear, stark illustration of what this kind of education can do for someone. And it does similar things for people who don't come from the kind of deficiencies and disadvantages that I came from. But in my case, that impact can be very is brought to relief, can be very, very stark, very visible, very, very evident.
Thank you, Roosevelt. And of course, everything you're saying today is on really vivid, detailed, intimate display in the book. So if people want to hear more about Roosevelt's lifelong engagement with liberal education, of which he's already given you a great taste, the book goes into this in a great deal of detail. I can't recommend it highly enough. Okay, I'm gonna ask you about the general framing of the book, though. So in the book, you say, I'm going to quote you again. Arguments about the importance of liberal education always and necessarily fall short, and are typically most appreciated by those who least need it, end quote. Now, you don't think in the book that we should dispense entirely with arguments of this kind, which is to say, arguments about the importance of liberal education. And indeed, in several places in the book, you offer arguments of this kind. But to make the case for liberal education, you pursue a different strategy in the book than just offering arguments. This is the way you characterize it, quote, to, quote, bring the reader closer to the experience of liberal education through encounters with some of the human questions that lie at its heart, end quote. And in particular, you do this by letting us in on some of your own encounters, primarily with 4 authors, St. Augustine, Plato, Freud, and Gandhi. Could you talk us through the problem as you see it with arguments about the importance of liberal education and your rationale for taking this alternative approach that you've adopted in the book to making the case for the importance of liberal education? That is, could you take us through the thinking behind this elegant blend of argument, autobiography, and textual interpretation that are at the core of the book?
Yeah, thank you. That question really is at the core of the project of the book. And liberal education, if you get back to what it means, right? Liberal education is a kind of education that is appropriate for people who are free, right? That's the context in which that idea emerges is ancient Athens, a democratic society, but also a slave society. That is a society in which majority of the population is enslaved, but the state is governed democratically by its citizens. The citizens, many of them aristocrats, many of them with livelihoods built on precisely the slave labor of the city, but they were free in a way from manual labor and from other forms of labor, and free to engage in political pursuits, philosophical pursuits, matters of state, matters of governance. So liberal education emerges as the idea of what kind of education is appropriate for this sort of free person. That is the person whose life activity revolves around self-governance at the individual level and at the collective level. What kind of education do you need to be an effective member of a self-governing society? And you could immediately realize that an education like that is going to not be organized around a professional activity, a professional task, but really take in everything that involves the human experience. Questions about history and philosophy and science and religion and the arts, every area of knowledge that is relevant to a human life comes in the purview of a liberal education. So what does a liberal education do? What does a liberal education deliver? A liberal education delivers an individual who is maximally equipped to live out a free life. Again, both as an individual, a certain kind of inner organization, inner ordering, inner integration that permits sort of the maximal exercise of our freedom, of our spontaneity, of our creativity, of a distinctly human form of flourishing. Also, freedom in the collective sense that allows us to participate in the collective debates, the coordination, the deliberation, the decision-making that organizes our society. That's the outcome. That's what you get, a person who is maximally prepared and equipped to operate in that collective and individual form of freedom. So liberal education is about personal cultivation, is about inner transformation, is about inner growth. It, of course, presents a problem, a difficulty about assessing it, right? About measuring how effective it is. But it also presents a problem about how to communicate why it's valuable, because it is an experiential thing. So almost anybody who has experienced a liberal education says, "Oh, it's the most important aspect of my education." Almost everybody who has not experienced a liberal education does not go around saying, "Oh, I feel like I'm missing something in my life." So the experience is profoundly subjective, is profoundly individual, is profoundly specific, and personal. Sometimes I talk to faculty members who are sort of in the battle of persuading their institutions to invest in the humanities or to promote liberal education, and they have to persuade sometimes deans and provosts and presidents who increasingly come from non-academic backgrounds, who sort of see the university enterprise as a kind of business that with questions of sustainability, financial stability and revenue and expenses, and some of those university leaders have not had a liberal education. And I always say, to my colleagues, don't go there telling them about how this wonderful education that these people don't have and have not had makes you a more deep and thoughtful and nuanced person, because you run the risk of insulting them. So that gets me back to about why writing the book, with a focus on the personal story, because I wanted to illustrate, not just by saying I am this and that, but by actually working through some of the problems and issues that presented themselves in my own life, and how my education, my liberal education, sort of played out in the way I negotiated this situation, that situation, how it transformed me. So that the personal experience of education has to be at the center of any case that we make for the value of liberal education. One more thing about that, that's why it's so important to, when you are going to make a case like that for why this form of education ought to be preserved and supported in the university, that you get the voices of people whose lives have been transformed and impacted by that. Not the voices of professors, not the voices of people whose professional and whose paycheck is tied to the enterprise, but people who are out there being physicians and fathers and entrepreneurs and musicians and computer scientists and business people who can come and say, look, this is the way that this education has played out in this life. And this is why without it, I wouldn't be the person that I am today. And this is why it's worth making it available to people, to young people in college today.
Thank you, Roosevelt. I mean, I think among the many services of this book, one of them would be to equip those who are having meetings with the university administrators with something that they can deliver that's and likewise a general approach to making the case. I have a temptation to just unmute all at this point and start collecting testimonials from the various people present about their own experiences, transformative experiences with liberal education. But yeah, it's a stirring call to this kind of advocacy. We're only going to be able to get a sample of just about everything I asked you about today. The book is this experience of having an extended, intimate encounter with your life and your experiences of these texts and so forth. But I thought we might try a short sample of that experience by having you read a passage that I found especially rich. So this is a passage in which you are talking about reading St. Augustine's Confessions in one moment in Augustine's Confessions in particular, and it's about the manner in which you see some of the thinking that Augustine does in the Confessions as similar to a kind of thinking that liberal education enables. This is on page 54 to 55 of the book. Could you read it for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Just by way of a little bit of context, I read St. Augustine's Confessions in the first year required literature core class at Columbia called Liturgy Humanities. It's a course that begins with Homer's Iliad. Every first year student takes it. Iliad, Odyssey, Greek playwrights, etc. The spring semester begins around the turn of the Common Era, and one of the first texts that we read in the spring semester is St. Augustine's Confessions. So second semester, the beginning of second semester of my freshman year, I encountered St. Augustine, and had a profound effect in my life. And this passage I'm going to read comes in thinking about that experience. Reading Augustine and other ancients, as I do with undergraduates, is a sort of archaeological exercise. Much of what seems strange and remote has, in fact, a genealogical relation to how we understand the world today. Spending time with these ideas and perspectives deepens our understanding of the contemporary world by revealing how what we think today emerges from and is shaped by discarded foundations. Ancient articles of faith, for instance, like ancient myths, may strike us as simplistic and misguided, at odds with our own perceptions and certainties. Yet they often contain deep human truths, even if clothed in language we no longer understand or grounded on metaphysical assumptions we no longer share. But like the archaeologist, with care and interest, we can recover some of the ancient understandings and use them to enrich and add texture to our contemporary knowledge. Such an exercise has the salutary effect of sowing a little doubt on our own certainties, reminding us that we too are historically circumscribed. So with the ancients, and with anyone really, before a dismissal of what seems apparently wrong, patently wrong, it is worth asking, in what way are they right?
Thanks very much. And my question is effectively about this passage, is effectively a call to you to expand. But so could you tell us about how your reading of this passage in Augustine helps to clarify your understanding of the value of liberal education more generally?
You know, the kind of liberal education that I had and the kind of liberal education that the basic program is committed to is organized around the reading of what we call great books. Sometimes they're called classics or canonical texts or important texts or transformative texts. There are all kinds of monikers that you can use, but they are texts that somehow fundamentally illuminate the experience we all have in common of being human. That is, they are texts that speak beyond their historical circumscription. They transcend the historical conditions of their own creation and are able to speak to and illuminate a human life that has virtually no historical connection to that. You know, when I read Dante, the way that Dante can clarify my own human experience has nothing to do with the fact that I'm a Dominican immigrant to the United States, and it has nothing to do with the fact that Dante was an exiled political figure and poet in Florence in the 13th century. It is because Dante is able to speak beyond that I am able to connect and resonate with Dante. Same thing happens with Augustine. And part of what my book is arguing and my treatment with Augustine tries to demonstrate is that even a book as old as the Confessions, coming from a world and a voice so different than most of our students, you know, Augustine is a North African intellectual. He is a leading philosophical figure of his day in the sort of Roman Empire, and he has this profound conversion to Christianity. And the Confessions is a devotional, prayer-like account of his own coming to Christian revelation. My God, you know, most of our students may not even be Christian or have any direct point of connection to that. Yet, part of what I want to say is that a book like this can be exceedingly, superbly, transformatively relevant to someone in our contemporary world, because we can see how this world became what it is, how the categories that we use today to understand ourselves, how the categories of time and self and justice and goodness and God and the absence of God and free will have been shaped, have been bequeathed to us by a tradition of thinking and creation. So one sort of thing that I emphasize in my own teaching, that I emphasize in the book, is that question that I end that passage with: in what way are they right? That is, can we read this text with the question of in what way are these texts putting their finger on something that is valuable, significant, and illuminating, rather than a way of reading that has become very pervasive, possibly even dominant in the academy, which is to read texts, particularly ancient texts, to look for the ways in which they're wrong. That is, to look for the ways in which they are limited, in which they are narrow, in which they are morally unevolved, in which they articulate prejudices and forms of bigotry that we reject today. And sometimes that's just called a critical reading. Yet, that is not what makes these books worth reading. What makes them worth reading is the other part. What makes them worth reading is that they contain in them a kind of mirror through which we can understand more deeply and more clearly our human experience today. That's what makes them great, right? And that's not why not every book provides that kind of reward. And we have a long sort of tradition of debate and scholarship and examination that is a tremendously useful guide in identifying some of these texts that have that enduring capacity to illuminate our human experience.
Thank you. This is a really interesting, challenging articulation of the value of this image of archaeology, not archaeology in the sense of placing things we dig up in their trapped irremediably in their historical contexts as objects of curiosity for us, but it's a kind of archaeology that engages us in archaeologies of the texts that are also works of personal and collective archaeology, sort of on ourselves and what's deep in us, and the kind of bridge that this builds between us and the texts and the questions they raise.
Yeah, and I can add that this highlights one great value of a kind of chronological approach to reading text. I mean, texts will be valuable even if you just read them in isolation. But if you understand the textual tradition as a kind of conversation, you can really see these things evolving. You know, if you have read Aristotle and his ideas about the thing that is pursued for its own sake, the end of every inquiry, or if you understand his idea of an unmoved mover, right, an original cause that unleashes the cause and event chains that surround us. And if you read Plato and you understand something about his notion of the good and his theory of forms, when you get to St. Augustine, you can see those ideas evolving, and you can trace their lineage down to our conceptions of good and our conceptions of right and knowledge, and the Big Bang and our the cosmological theories that explain our existence. So you can see this evolution of ideas. You can see that in the ancient world, for example, nobody's talking about rights. Aristotle writes a whole book about politics, and the issue of rights never emerges. Plato writes a whole book, even longer, describing an ideal city, and the idea of individual rights and individual freedom doesn't appear. Well, it means that those ideas that are like, without which we can't even think about politics, have a history. They have an evolution. They are not self-evident and descended from on high. They are worked out and evolve and continue to evolve. So it is extraordinarily important and valuable for students to have a taste of the ways in which the categories through which we understand the world, which seem evident and irrefutable, in fact are evolved and constructed and continue to evolve and to be constructed.
Well, you're already in the territory of addressing my next big question. So the next question that I have for you is, when liberal education goes well in a classroom, what happens, and what do the people involved get out of it?
When we were talking before we opened the Zoom, and I was telling you all how much I admire what you do, and I said that in a classroom, grades and credits can serve to undermine our mission, because what happens in the classroom is a process of cultivation and transformation that is deeply, and now I'm talking about the liberal arts classroom, that's deeply personal and deeply subjective. When I teach Plato in a liberal arts classroom, and I'm teaching Plato to, say, first-year students or second-year students, some of whom are going to major in chemistry, and some of them are going to major in computer science, and some of them might major in philosophy. What I'm teaching them is not really Plato, both because I'm not an expert in Plato, but also because what I am doing is using Plato as a way to provoke and stimulate and equip a certain kind of inner exploration, a certain kind of investigation. We are engaged in a shared investigation where we are not only interested on what Plato said, we are interested in the questions that Plato was trying to answer. That is, we don't read the Republic to understand what Plato said about justice. We read the Republic to try to understand something about justice. That is, we keep the primary questions at the forefront of our teaching. And Plato is going to give us a lot of material, a lot of provocation, a lot of framework through which we can explore this question of what justice means. So we're going to learn a lot about Plato. We're going to learn a lot about his arguments. We're going to learn a lot about his philosophy. But 10 years from now, unless you major in philosophy, it doesn't matter whether you remember exactly what it is that Plato said and how he constructed his arguments. What matters is that you have internalized and explored. You had internalized a set of questions and a set of tools with which to explore that fundamental question that Plato was exploring. So what happens in a liberal class, in a liberal arts classroom, is a kind of collective conversation that equips the students to approach fundamental questions in their own life with greater clarity, with greater skill, with greater awareness, with a kind of wider lens. And I'll say one other thing about the classroom, because the form of liberal education that we're committed to, and I think that we have come to believe is the most effective form of liberal education, revolves around conversation. That is, it does not revolve around the transmission of knowledge from an expert to novices. It involves a shared communal activity of thinking. That is, it taps into this weird capacity that we human beings have of thinking together. You know, it's like today, computers, we can link together servers, we can link together computing capacity and chain it and have access to the whole array. Human beings can do that. We can sort of network each other and think thoughts and develop ideas and work through problems that nobody could do individually, but we can do as a group. We can do together when we think together. So part of what happens in the classroom is that we learn this capacity, and we expand and exercise that capacity to think together, to deliberate together, to listen to each other, to disagree, to agree, to resolve disagreements, to move to higher levels of abstraction, to negotiate difference. One of the ways that the liberal arts classroom is a laboratory for democracy, because all of the skills of collective self-governance and deliberation and decision-making that are required for the life of democracy are also exercised and developed in the classroom. Now, that is one of the arguments that you can put forth for why this kind of education is valuable. And I'm always reluctant to instrumentalize the education, to say, this education should be done because it makes us better citizens, or because it makes us better computer programmers, or because it makes us better earners in our jobs. Because at the end of the day, the value of the activity is intrinsic to itself. It's not validated by its outcomes, but there are outcomes. And among the most important of those outcomes in our society is this enhanced capacity for democratic living.
Mm-hmm. There's another good articulation of why the argumentative territory here is tricky for anyone who wants to make an argument for the value of liberal education. I'm going to ask one more question of my own, and then I'm going to take questions from the chat. So people who've entered questions, we probably at this point have more than I'm going to be able to read, but you should feel free to put more questions in the chat, and we'll do what we can. So the last question, so naturally enough, given your background and given the sort of national and global focus on liberal education, in the book, you focus mostly on the liberal education of undergraduates, but here you are at in a talk at the Grant School of which does liberal education for adults. Are there any especially useful ways in which your views about the nature and value of liberal education apply to lifelong liberal education in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I should say I love teaching undergraduates, and part of the agenda of this book is to stimulate um, stimulate colleges, universities, and professors to take this kind of education more seriously and to put it more centrally in the undergraduate curriculum. And I love teaching these ideas in these books to sort of fresh, innocent young people who are just beginning to exercise their own autonomy, their own freedom, their own sort of self-determination, and to put in front of them these kinds of ideas and provocations at that sort of moment of inception of their adult lives. It's very powerful and rewarding for me. But even more than that, I love having the kinds of discussions that I have with this text precisely in contexts like this, where the people are bringing in rich life experiences, and that are not there in this institutional conveyor belt. You know, you're a sophomore, you're a junior, you're learning 4 credits for this, you're going to graduate, and in the next hour you're going to your computer science class, and you're going to do my homework that I assigned, the reading next to the problem set that you're going to be doing. It sort of routinizes this and turns it into a chore. And that is inimical to what I actually want to do in the classroom, which is to have very, very serious conversations about these questions because they matter as the questions they are. Well, when you remove that in a context like this, people who come and decide to spend their time reading these texts and discussing them with others, precisely because they matter, precisely because they have some kind of intrinsic value, that really opens up the conversation and opens up the possibilities for the kind of deep, authentic, revelatory engagement that these texts can most ideally produce. Those are the ideal conditions in which to engage them. The other thing that's really different is that, you know, take King Lear, a book that I teach to first year students, and it's, you know, those of you who remember King Lear, is so much about King Lear is about getting old. Is about reaching that stage in your life where you leave the spotlight, where the world and the forces and the mechanism of the world is moving on, and you are no longer driving. You are now coasting to your eventual exit from the stage. Well, you know, reading that with 18 and 19-year-olds, and reading that with adults, as I have done too. I've taught that book to senior to lifelong learners, people who are retired, who are coming back to do something like what you do in the basic program. Oh my God, that is a really different conversation. It's a really different discussion, and it's a discussion in which I engage with a kind of pleasure and excitement, because in a situation like that, I have more to learn of the people who are reading the book with me than I have to teach. And that balance is a little bit different when I'm with 18-year-olds. I have many things to learn from them, and I do, but they have more to learn from me than I have from them. And that when that situation is reversed, and I am talking with people whose life experiences exceed my own, and who bring in perspectives and backgrounds and contexts and sensibilities and traditions that are far from my own, that are not accessible to me otherwise. That is one of the most thrilling intellectual situations for me, and I love doing it. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that the reason why these books are worth reading in college for the first time is so that you can read them again and think about them again and live and age with them. That's really the point. You read them for the first time because you have to read them at some point for the first time. But the thing that makes that first time reading most valuable, it's that then you can get to read it again. It's that then you can get to live with these works.
Thanks so much, Roosevelt. Well, I have to apologize in advance to people who are entering questions into the chat because I'm doing my best to sort through them and make some kind of priority among them because we only have about 5 minutes left in the event, and there's so many good questions that I've already found. So this is going to be a little bit arbitrary, the selection. My apologies if I mispronounce anyone's name. So this question comes from someone here today named Alan Royd. He asks, how do you counter the argument that such education, liberal education, creates an elite when most people do not experience it? How can they relate to it or see its value?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the way I see it is simple. The fact that this kind of education is inaccessible to so many people is the problem. That is, what we have to work on is not to devalue or delegitimize this form of education, but to expand it and universalize it. One of the great promises of one of the great sort of aspects of the American dream is the idea that higher education should be available to everyone, to the common man. That's a recent idea. That's a 20th century idea and an American idea. For all of the existence of the university and higher education as an institution, it had been the province of a small elite. And America, with its sort of universalizing thrust and commitments to equality, in the middle of the 20th century, most significantly with the GI Bill, said, you know what, regular people, the children of farmers and shopkeepers and manual laborers ought to have a shot, access and support, public support for college attendance. And that is the ideal, that is the aspiration, that this form of education be accessible and be available to everyone. That is, that it not be an elite education, even though it continues to be, not as much as it used to be. Here's somebody speaking to you who 50 years ago, there's no way he would have had access to this kind of education. So I am an example of what, of the possibility and of the aspiration of making this form of education as widely accessible as absolutely possible. So one way of saying it is that we should put all of our efforts into making this not be an elite education, but be the common education for everyone.
Thanks very much, Roosevelt. We have time, it seems, for just one more question. This one strikes me as interesting. So this is from Lucas Frere. Isn't there a tension between the philological task of understanding texts in their original context, as far as that can be reconstructed, including from original languages, on the one hand, and on the other hand, reading the text as relevant for us today? Or can these two tasks be reconciled?
I suppose you can say that there is a tension between them, but I'm not sure that how far that tension dichotomy holds. That is, to understand them in their historical context, in their traditional context, deepens your engagement with them. That is, it clarifies what they're doing, and it only adds to the richness, to the connections that it holds to the contemporary world, or that is to the to your contemporary life. Now, again, I'm talking about how you read these texts in a liberal education context. You can read this text as a specialist, right? You can read this text, you know, if you're a Latinist, and you can read St. Augustine to see the ways in which he had an influence on the development of particular forms of rhetorical and textual analysis and interpretation. So you can certainly study them in a specialized way that largely brackets this basic human significance that they have, not for the scholar, but for the general reader, right? But when you enter into a liberal education context in which we read these texts because of the value they have in illuminating our common humanity, when you are reading in that context, then the sort of specialized philological, historical contextualization of the book becomes another tool to crack it open, becomes another tool to deepen the engagement with the text for what it says. And so that's, maybe the dichotomy that points to, that the question points to. I think we can more usefully think about it in the context of liberal education as the dichotomy between a general liberal education approach to a text and a specialized scholarly approach to a text.
Thanks very much, Roosevelt. Well, that is all we have time for. I just want to thank you. I know our dean, Seth Green, wants to give us a final word.
I just want to say a huge thank you. This has been, as was said in the discussion, a priceless conversation. I mean, this is a remarkable set of, I see story and argument for the value of liberal education. And I'll say, as a school that really prides itself on the power of great books, you have given us a new vocabulary to advance this mission and to think about its profound and important role in our lives. And I just want to say the mission that you set, which is how do we expand this to more people so that this is not an elite affair, but this is something that is part of every human experience, is one that we take very seriously. It's part of the founding mission of the school, and one that we hope to continue to grow in the years to come. So thank you for being a real nudge in the direction that we wanted to head, and an extraordinary intellectual and personal case for doing so. And Noah, thank you for bringing out all this insight through extraordinary moderation. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon and feels inspired and energized by this conversation. Thank you all.